The hall was so massive that clouds formed near its ceiling. Thousands of alien dignitaries filled the tiered seats, their bodies glowing, shifting, buzzing, or simply towering above each other in forms no human I had ever been trained to read. The light inside the Veiltheri Grand Court came from the stars themselves, funneled through enormous crystal lenses in the roof, and it fell in long silver bars across the marble floor where Kale Doran walked alone. He walked slowly, not because he was afraid, though he had every reason to be. He walked slowly because his boots were new and the floor was slippery, and he had promised himself he would not fall on the most important day of his life. He was 29 years old. He was human. He was the only human being in the room, and he was about to be married to the most powerful ruler in the known galaxy. Empress Saravale of the Veiltheri looked nothing like the images Kale had studied. The images had shown a tall, elegant woman with silver skin and 4 arms, standing very still in formal poses. In person, she moved like water running downhill, smooth, fast, and utterly without effort. She stood at the far end of the hall on a raised dais, dressed in layered robes that shifted color with every breath she took. Her 4 eyes, 2 of which could see frequencies of light human eyes could not even register, were fixed on him as he approached. The silence in the hall was complete. Then it broke. Empress Saravale laughed. It was not a quiet laugh. It was not polite or private. It rang through the hall like a bell struck too hard, and it brought answering sounds from the audience, a ripple of amusement moving through thousands of alien bodies. Some chirped, some buzzed, some made sounds like gravel shifting. All of them were laughing at the small human walking across the very large floor. Kale stopped walking. He stood in the center of the hall, under the silver light, and he looked up at the Empress. His face was calm. He had been told this might happen. His diplomatic briefing, all 400 pages of it, had included a section titled Managing Expectations of Inferiority. He had read it twice. He started walking again. The laughter faded slowly as he kept moving, unhurried, straight-backed, eyes forward. A few of the dignitaries leaned toward each other. The human had not flinched. That was, apparently, unexpected. Kale reached the dais steps and climbed them. He stopped 2 steps below the Empress, because that was the protocol. A groom presented himself below his ruler as a symbol of submission. He looked up at her. She looked down at him. Her 2 primary eyes were cold and amused. Her 2 secondary eyes, the ones that saw heat and electromagnetic fields, were studying him with something closer to interest. "You are smaller than I expected," she said. Her translator implant rendered it in clean, flat English. "You are taller than your portrait suggests," he replied. "Though I think the artists were afraid to paint you accurately. That's a kind of power, too." The amusement in her primary eyes shifted slightly. Not gone, but different. The ceremony that followed was not romantic. It was political. The Veiltheri Empire and the Terran Confederacy had been circling each other for 60 years, close enough to trade, far enough to avoid war. This marriage was the bridge. Kale was not a prince or a soldier. He was a diplomat's son who had spent 12 years learning Veiltheri law, culture, and 3 of their 7 major languages. He had been chosen not because he was impressive, but because he was the most prepared human being alive for this specific situation. He knew that. The Empress knew that. The galaxy did not particularly care. When the binding rings were placed, thin bands of living metal that responded to the wearer's biological signature, Kale felt his warm against his finger immediately. The Empress glanced at hers. It was still cool. That was normal, the briefing had said. The rings took time to adjust to Veiltheri physiology, but several of the dignitaries saw, and several of them made a note of it. The reception after the ceremony was an ocean of noise and color. Kale moved through it carefully, remembering names, remembering titles, remembering which species found direct eye contact aggressive and which found the lack of it insulting. He made no mistakes. He was not charming. Charm was a human social tool that didn't translate well, but he was precise, and precision was respected across nearly every culture in the galaxy. The Empress watched him from across the room for most of the evening. She had expected to spend the reception managing her new political symbol, keeping him out of trouble, translating his human blunders into something survivable. Instead, she watched him navigate the Keth ambassador's territorial greeting posture without backing down, calm the Rovar delegate who had been insulted by the seating arrangement, and then spend 20 minutes in quiet conversation with the ancient Vel scholar in the corner whom everyone else had been carefully avoiding. Her chief advisor, Marin, appeared at her shoulder. "He is not what we anticipated," Marin said. "No," the Empress agreed. The Vel scholar is laughing. She has not laughed in 11 years. Not since the Accords failed. Saravel said nothing. She picked up her glass and drank from it slowly, watching the small human in the corner make an 1100-year-old alien scholar laugh like a young person. Kale did not know he was being watched. He was too busy listening. That was the thing about him that no one in the galaxy had been briefed on, because it wasn't in any file. Kale Doran was a genuinely, deeply curious person. He didn't talk to the Vel scholar to be strategic. He talked to her because she was the oldest living being in the room, and she had been present at events that Kale had only read about in history books, and he wanted to know what they had actually felt like. He went to bed that night in a room the size of a Terran city block, alone, in a bed that smelled of something sweet and faintly electrical, in a palace on a world he had never visited before this morning. He stared at the ceiling, where bioluminescent organisms had been arranged to form a map of the Empire, thousands of tiny lights marking thousands of worlds. He was in a strange place, in a strange marriage, on a strange planet. He was also exactly where he had been working to be for 12 years. He closed his eyes and went to sleep without difficulty, which was itself a kind of quiet defiance. Because somewhere in the palace, the Empress was still awake, reviewing reports about her new husband, and finding that he was considerably more difficult to categorize than she had planned for. The first crisis came 11 days after the wedding, and it arrived without warning in the form of a message from the Keth Dominion. The Keth were not a species anyone insulted lightly. They were 8 feet tall on average, built like walking fortresses, and their empire spanned 19 star systems along the edge of Veil-Theory space. For 40 years, they had accepted a trade agreement that gave the Veil-Theory favorable terms on mineral exports from 3 Keth-controlled asteroid belts. The agreement was up for renewal. The Keth, apparently, had decided they were no longer interested in favorable terms. They were interested in new terms. Specifically, they wanted 3 Veil-Theory orbital stations transferred to Keth control as a condition of renewal. It was, by any measure, extortion. The Empress had known it was coming. Her intelligence service had flagged the possibility 6 months ago, but knowing it was coming and knowing how to stop it were 2 different problems. Kale found out about it the way he found out about most things in the palace, by being quiet in a room where people forgot he was present. He was reading in the outer chamber of the Empress's strategy room when her advisors filed past him without acknowledgement, and their conversation drifted through the open door in 3 languages, 2 of which he spoke. He finished his chapter. Then he knocked on the strategy room door. The room went silent. He opened the door and stepped inside. 6 of the Empress's senior advisors stared at him. The Empress herself stood at the center table, her 4 hands spread across a holographic map of the border systems. Her expression was not welcoming. "I heard some of it," Kale said. "The Keth demand. May I look at the file?" "This is not a matter for Terran involvement," said Advisor Lon, the oldest of the 6, a Veil-Theory male whose silver skin had gone almost white with age. His tone made his opinion of Kale's presence very clear. "With respect," Kale said, "the Terran Confederacy has had a standing trade agreement with the Keth Dominion for 22 years. We've renegotiated it 4 times. I was part of the last 2 negotiations." He paused. "I know their lead trade minister personally. We played cards for 6 hours once, waiting out a solar storm on Keth Station 9. Another silence. A different kind. The Empress looked at him for a long moment. Then she gestured at the table. "Show him the file." Kale spent the next 3 hours reading. The advisors watched him with varying degrees of suspicion and curiosity. He asked questions, specific, technical questions about the mineral yield projections, the station maintenance costs, the history of border incidents in the disputed sectors. He asked for the last 12 years of communication logs between the Veil-Theory Foreign Ministry and the Keth Trade Delegation. He found 3 things that no one else had flagged. The first was that the Keth demand had been submitted by the Trade Minister, not by the Dominion's War Council. That mattered. The War Council wanted the stations. The Trade Minister wanted something else, and was using the stations as leverage to get it. The second was that the asteroid belt in question, the one whose mineral exports the Keth wanted better terms on, had seen a sharp drop in yield for the past 3 years. The Keth were not extracting as much as they once had. They needed the revenue from better trade terms because their resource base was shrinking. The third was that the Veil Theory had, 8 years ago, developed a synthetic process for producing the exact same mineral compounds in orbital manufacturing facilities. The process was expensive, but it existed. The Keth did not know it existed because the research had been classified and had never been used at scale. Kale sat back and looked at the Empress. "They're afraid," he said. "Not aggressive. Afraid. Their primary export is becoming less valuable to you because you can make it yourselves, and they've started to realize it. This demand isn't about the stations. It's about making sure they're still indispensable." Advisor Lon opened his mouth. The Empress raised one hand, and Lon closed it again. "What would you do?" she asked Kale. "I'd give them what they actually need, not what they asked for," he said. "Offer them a ointment venture on the orbital manufacturing process. Let them be part of producing the synthetic compound. Their labor, your technology, shared profit. They stop being an export economy and become a manufacturing partner. They don't need the stations. They need relevance." The room was quiet for a long time. "That would require sharing proprietary technology," Marin said carefully. "Technology you're not using at scale anyway," Kale said. "The cost of sharing it is lower than the cost of losing 3 orbital stations or the cost of the conflict that follows if you refuse both." The Empress studied him. Her secondary eyes were doing the thing again, reading his heat signature, his electromagnetic output, the tiny physical signals that Veil Theory had evolved to read in each other and that she was apparently now applying to her human husband with some regularity. "Draft the proposal," she said. Not to her advisors. To Kale. He drafted it that night. It took him until the early hours of the morning, cross-referencing trade law in both systems, writing in 3 languages simultaneously, and at one point calling his old professor on Earth, waking her up at 2 in the morning her time, to check a detail about a precedent case from 40 years before. The Keth trade minister received the proposal 48 hours later. She called back in 6 hours, which in Keth diplomatic terms was the equivalent of running to the phone. The joint venture framework was agreed upon in principle within a week. The 3 orbital stations stayed Veil Theory. Word traveled, because word always traveled in the galaxy. By the time the formal agreement was signed, 12 other species diplomatic networks had logged the outcome and begun the quiet, careful process of reassessing what the Terran Confederacy's presence in the Veil Theory court actually meant. In the palace, something else was shifting. The Empress began including Kale in morning briefings. Not all of them. There were matters of Veil Theory internal governance where his presence would have been inappropriate, but the ones that touched on border relations, trade, and species dynamics. She did not explain this change to her advisors. She did not need to. What she noticed, and did not say out loud, was that Kale never tried to take credit. When the Keth agreement was praised in the Senate, he deflected the attention toward the Empress's decision to consider the proposal and her advisor's execution of the negotiations. He was not performing modesty. She had her secondary eyes, and she could tell the difference. He genuinely did not seem to need the acknowledgement. It was, in her experience, the rarest thing in politics. She also noticed that her binding ring had grown warm sometime during the second week. She looked at it one morning before her briefing and turned it in the light and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed to be said yet. But she stopped laughing when his name came up in conversation. The Galactic Senate met once every 3 years on a station so large it had its own weather systems. 240 species sent representatives. The sessions lasted, on average, for months. Nothing was ever truly decided at the Galactic Senate. It was more of a formalized place for grievances, alliances, and the slow grinding work of interspecies diplomacy, but what happened there mattered enormously, because everyone was watching everyone else. The Empress attended with a delegation of 30. Kale was included, which caused immediate commentary, because consorts did not attend the Senate. They were decorative political fixtures, not participants. The Veil Theory ambassador to the Senate, an elderly woman named Thress who had been doing this job for 50 years, pulled Kale aside before the opening session and told him very clearly that his role was to be present, not to speak. Understood, Kale said pleasantly. He did not speak during the opening session. He sat slightly behind and to the left of the Empress, which was the correct position for a consort, and he listened to 6 hours of formal addresses from delegations across the galaxy. He took notes in a small book, actual paper, which several alien delegates found remarkable and slightly baffling. Paper was, from a galactic technology standpoint, comically primitive. On the second day, the Rovar Collective raised a complaint against the Veiltheri Empire. The Rovar were a mid-sized species, about 40 billion individuals spread across 8 systems, and their complaint was technical in nature. They claimed a Veiltheri shipping lane had been moved without notice, cutting through a region of space that the Rovar considered sacred under the Mull Accords of 2287. The Veiltheri position was that the sacred space designation had expired under a subsection of the same accords. Both sides were correct. The accords were badly written, as most 700-year-old documents are, and the conflicting clauses had never been reconciled. The Senate Legal Committee was expected to take this question, sit on it for 2 years, and produce a report that would satisfy no one. Kale raised his hand. Thress looked at him with an expression that could have stopped a comet. He kept his hand up. The session moderator, a Vel arbitration specialist, noticed the raised hand from the Veiltheri delegation's secondary row and paused. The consort of the Veiltheri Empress wishes to address the body, the moderator said, with the particular tone of someone asking a question they do not expect to be answered yes. If permitted, Kale said, the Empress had a choice in that moment. She could have declined on his behalf, which would have been the safe and normal and expected thing to do. She looked at Thress, who was silently projecting something very close to horror. Then she looked at Kale, who was sitting quietly with his paper notebook and his calm face, and she thought about the Keth trade agreement, and the Vel scholar who had laughed for the first time in 11 years, and the binding ring that had gone warm on the 9th day. Permitted, she said. 240 delegations oriented toward the small human who stood up in the secondary row of the Veiltheri section. Kale did not use a prepared speech. He had thought about this possibility. The Senate sessions were publicly scheduled, and the Rovar complaint was not a secret, but he had not written anything down because he didn't think he would need to. He knew the Mull Accords. He had read them as a student, because they were foundational documents of galactic law, and he had a memory that held text very well. He cited 4 specific clauses. He then explained, in plain language, that the conflict between the clauses had been anticipated by the original drafters. There were records from the negotiation sessions of 2287, showing that the arbitrators knew about the conflict and had chosen deliberately ambiguous language because both sides needed to be able to claim a favorable reading in order to sign. The ambiguity was not a flaw. It was the mechanism. The accords worked because each side could interpret them favorably. The moment a definitive ruling was issued, the mechanism would break, and the accords would collapse as a functional framework. He then proposed that instead of a legal ruling, both parties agree to a practical solution, a small rerouting of the shipping lane, requiring a 4-day longer travel time, in exchange for a Rovar agreement to formally extend the sacred space designation under updated accord language that everyone could agree on before the next Senate session. He sat down. The Rovar lead delegate asked for a recess. The recess lasted 2 hours. They came back and accepted the framework in principle. The Senate Hall's ambient sound, the constant low hum of 240 different species breathing, shifting, and communicating, changed after that. It was subtle. It was the kind of thing you only noticed if you were paying attention to rooms the way Kale paid attention to rooms. But the Empress noticed it, and Marin noticed it, and Thress, who had been doing this for 50 years, noticed it most of all, and found, to her own considerable surprise, that she was not angry about it. The story of the human consort who had solved the Rovar shipping dispute in 4 minutes. A problem the Senate Legal Committee had been expected to sit on for 2 years, spread through the station by the end of the day. By the end of the week, it had reached every capital in the galaxy. Delegations began requesting meetings with Kale directly, not with the Veiltheri delegation, with him, personally. Old disputes, tangled treaties, problems that had been quietly festering for decades because no one had wanted to start the difficult conversation, or because the right starting point wasn't obvious, or because every species involved was too proud to be the one to extend the first hand. Kale met with as many as he could. He was honest with all of them. He had no authority to commit the Veiltheri Empire to anything. He could listen, he could think, he could suggest frameworks. What happened next was their business. He solved 4 more disputes in the remaining 3 months of the Senate session. Not dramatically, quietly, in small meeting rooms, over long conversations. But each solution held, and each one was noticed. On the last day of the session, a Vel elder, not the same one from the wedding reception, but a different one, older, approached Kale in the corridor outside the main hall. The Vel were among the oldest spacefaring species in the galaxy. This one had been alive for 4,000 years. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she pressed her hands together in a gesture that Kale recognized from his studies as the Vel gesture of formal recognition, the kind offered to someone who had done something of lasting worth. "We have watched humans for a long time," she said. Her translator rendered it in careful, measured English. "We wondered what you were for, in the larger sense. Every species has a role they are suited for, whether they know it or not." She paused. "I think we understand now." Kale thought about asking what she meant, but he had learned, over the past months, that some answers settled better when you gave them room to breathe. He pressed his hands together in return and bowed slightly, and she made a sound that her translator rendered as satisfied, and they went their separate ways down the corridor. That night, on the journey back to the Veiltheri homeworld, the Empress sat across from Kale in the ship's quiet observation room and looked at him for a while without speaking. The stars moved past the window behind him. "You knew about the Malachord's drafting records," she said. "Before the session. You had read them. Years ago," he said. "I wasn't sure they'd come up. But you were ready." He considered this. "I'm usually ready for things I've already thought about," he said. "The writer part is being ready for things you haven't." She said nothing for a while. Then, "What do you want, Kale? You came here for a political arrangement. You've done more than anyone expected. What do you actually want from this?" He looked out at the stars. "Same thing I've always wanted," he said. "To understand things. To be useful. To be in rooms where the important conversations are happening." He glanced back at her. "I think I'm in the right rooms." She held his gaze longer than she usually allowed herself to. "Yes," she said quietly. "I think you are." The crisis that finally broke everything open arrived 2 years after the wedding, and it was the kind of crisis that couldn't be solved quietly. A species called the Drev had been in civil war for 11 years. They were a small people, only 4 billion, spread across 2 systems. And their war was a contained tragedy that the larger powers of the galaxy had been comfortable ignoring. The Veiltheri had a minor trade relationship with one of the Drev factions. The Terran Confederacy had sent humanitarian aid 3 times without meaningful result. Everyone else had decided the Drev were too far from anything important to be worth the political cost of involvement. Then the Drev discovered something in the outer belt of their second system, a cache of ancient weapons, predating the current galactic civilizations by at least 10,000 years. The origin was unknown. The weapons were not. They were of a class that operated on principles no current species could replicate, and their destructive yield was, by the best estimates anyone could produce in 48 hours of panicked analysis, approximately enough to sterilize a planet. Both Drev factions immediately claimed ownership. Both factions sent messages to the Galactic Senate demanding recognition of their claim. The Senate emergency session convened in 24 hours, which was by galactic standards the equivalent of moving at the speed of sound. Kale was in the emergency session. He had been in the Empress's strategy room when the first reports came in, and he had not left. He had been awake for 31 hours by the time the Senate convened, and he had spent those hours reading everything the Veiltheri Intelligence Service had on the Drev, on the ancient weapons cache, and on the 11-year history of the Civil War. The session was chaos. Every major power wanted control of the weapons. Every minor power was terrified of the major powers getting control of the weapons. The Drev factions were demanding things that were mutually exclusive. The Vel elders, who had been quiet observers of galactic politics for centuries, were visibly alarmed, and the Vel were not a species that showed alarm easily. Advisor Lon looked across the table at Kale during a recess. "You've been quiet," he said. It was not an accusation. Lon had changed in 2 years, slowly, in the way that people who are very sure of themselves sometimes change when they encounter consistent evidence that challenges their certainty. He still didn't entirely trust Kale, but he had started listening to him. "I'm thinking," Kale said. "We all are," Lon said. "Yes, but I think I'm thinking about a different problem than everyone else in that room," Kale said. "Everyone else is thinking about who gets the weapons. I've been thinking about why they were buried." Lon went very still. "What did you find?" The geological surveys of the outer belt, Kale said. The cache wasn't hidden accidentally. The strata above it were disturbed, deliberately sealed. Someone buried those weapons with intent. He paused. Whoever built them decided, at some point, that they should not be used. They didn't destroy them. Maybe they couldn't, or maybe they thought they might be needed someday. But they buried them, and they sealed the site. He looked at the holographic display of the Drev system. The question isn't who owns them. The question is whether we are the civilization that was supposed to find them. And right now, I don't think we are. I think we are the same kind of problem that made whoever came before us bury them in the first place. The session reconvened. The argument continued for another 4 hours. And then the Empress of the Veiltheri Empire, the most powerful single ruler in the galaxy, stood up and asked to address the body. Every voice in the hall went silent. She spoke for 11 minutes. She laid out the geological evidence. She described the deliberate sealing of the cache. She presented the argument, Kale's argument, though she did not name him, that the weapons had been buried by a civilization that had faced the same choice the Senate was now facing and had chosen not to use them. She then proposed a framework. The weapons would not be claimed by any current species. They would be placed under joint guardianship of all Senate member species equally, sealed again under independent verification, and left alone until the galaxy could demonstrate the kind of stability and unity that would make such weapons unnecessary. Any species that attempted to claim them unilaterally would face collective response from all others. It was bold. It was unprecedented. It required every major power in the room to voluntarily give up something they all wanted. The vote took 3 hours of maneuvering. It passed. The Drev Civil War, stripped of the prize that had supercharged it, collapsed into ceasefire negotiations within a month. Without the weapons as a prize, neither faction could justify continued losses to their populations. The ceasefire held. It was not a perfect peace. It would take years more to become anything close to that, but it held. In the aftermath, as the Senate session wound down and delegations prepared to return to their home systems, something happened that had no precedent in the recorded history of the Galactic Senate. The Vel Elders, all 7 of them, the oldest living beings in the galaxy, walked to the Veiltheri delegations section. They stopped in front of the Empress. They pressed their hands together in the gesture of formal recognition. And then, one by one, they turned to Kale and repeated the gesture. Kale stood up. He pressed his hands together in return and bowed. His face was calm, the way it always was, but his eyes were bright. Every delegation in the hall was watching. The Vel Elders did not offer this gesture lightly. They did not offer it to individuals. They offered it to those who had, in some meaningful way, moved the story of the galaxy forward. The images circulated everywhere within hours. The small human, standing in the Veiltheri section, receiving the Vel recognition. The Empress beside him, and the expression on her face, which was not the cold amusement of a ruler managing a political symbol, but something much warmer and far more complicated. Back on the Veiltheri homeworld, in the months that followed, things were different, not loudly different. Kale was not suddenly celebrated in the streets or given a formal title or placed on any official list of important figures. He was still, officially, the Empress's consort, a diplomatic arrangement, a political bridge, the small human from the small confederacy who had married into the largest empire in the galaxy. But every ambassador who visited the palace now requested time with him as part of their schedule. Every treaty that touched on multi-species relations moved through his office for review. The Vel scholar from the wedding reception sent him a gift, a book, a physical book, handwritten, containing her personal record of 600 years of galactic history, with a note that said simply, "For the one who listens." And the Empress, who had laughed at him on the day they met because he was small and soft and human, and she had not expected anything from him, sat with him one evening in the observatory at the top of the palace, looking out at the map of her empire written in stars. "I owe you an apology," she said. "From the first day." "You don't," he said. "You didn't know me. I judged you on what you were, not who you were." "Most people do," he said. "It's not a flaw. It's just the first version of a thing. You updated." She was quiet for a while. The stars were very bright. Her ring was warm. It had been warm for a long time now. "What do humans say," she said, "when they have been wrong about someone and they want to say so honestly?" He thought about it. "We say, 'I'm glad I was wrong.'" She looked at him. "I am glad I was wrong," she said. He smiled. It was a small smile, the kind he wore most of the time, not performing anything, just present, just real. "I know," he said. "I could tell somewhere around day 9. She laughed. It was a completely different sound from the one that had echoed through the Grand Court 2 years ago. That laugh had been dismissal. This one was the sound of someone genuinely, unexpectedly delighted. Outside, in the Empire, in the galaxy, in the long, slow turning of history, things were changing. Not because of war or conquest or the threat of ancient weapons. Because one human being had walked into a room where he wasn't expected to matter and had simply, quietly, been exactly who he was.